Broken glass crunched under her boots on the stone steps. Mirren Thatch stopped and looked down at the shards scattered across the worn limestone like scattered teeth. Somebody had thrown a rock through the front window a long time ago. The glass had weathered into smooth, frosted pieces that caught the late afternoon light and held it. She bent down and picked up one piece and held it between her thumb and forefinger against the fading sun. It was thick glass with tiny bubbles trapped inside from the old way of making it. She set the piece carefully on the stone wall beside the steps and kept climbing toward the building above. The watchmaker's shop sat halfway up the hillside above Main Street in Whitesburg, Kentucky. 27 stone steps led from the cracked sidewalk below to a narrow wooden building wedged into the rocky slope at a steep angle. The structure was 2 stories tall, but barely wider than a hallway, with a steep cedar-shake roof gone silver with age and tall, narrow windows set deep into thick wooden frames. A painted clock face above the front door showed the time frozen at 4:17, the hands rusted in place for decades. Mountain laurel grew wild across the terraced ground on both sides of the stone steps. Exposed rock jutted from the hillside behind the building like the spine of something ancient buried underneath the soil. Mirren stood on the top step and looked back down over the rooftops of the small town below her. Whitesburg sat deep in Letcher County, population around 2,100, coal country in the eastern Kentucky mountains. From up here, she could see the courthouse clock tower and the flat roofs of the storefronts along Main Street and the narrow river cutting through the valley floor. The mountains rose on every side, dark green and close, pressing in like shoulders hunched against the cold mountain wind. She turned back to the shop door and studied it for a moment. A rusted padlock hung open on its hasp. She pushed the door, and it swung inward with a low groan of swollen wood scraping across a stone threshold. The smell hit her first and stopped her in the doorway. Old wood and machine oil and something faintly metallic like copper left in the rain for years. The room was narrow and deep, maybe 12 feet wide and 30 feet long. A glass-topped display counter ran the entire length of the left wall. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling wooden cabinets with dozens of small labeled drawers filled the back wall entirely. A workbench stretched along the right side under the tall windows, its surface scarred with tool marks and stained dark from decades of oil and polish. Tiny brass screws and springs and fragments of watch parts still littered every corner of the workspace. Mirren ran her fingertips along the edge of the workbench and felt the grain beneath the grime. She knew this kind of surface intimately. She knew the feel of a bench where precise work had been done for years and years without stopping. Before everything fell apart, she had spent 14 months working as an assistant at Bellwether Fine Repair in Lexington. Old Mr. Griggs had taught her to disassemble a pocket watch movement, piece by piece, without bending a single hairspring. She learned to clean jewel bearings with pith sticks and to regulate a balance wheel by feel as much as by sight. She had steady hands and unusual patience for someone her age, and Mr. Griggs told her she had the temperament of a clockmaker born in the wrong century entirely. Then the building was sold to a new owner who wanted a vape shop in the space. Mr. Griggs retired to his daughter's house in Florida without much fanfare. Mirren lost her job and her apartment in the same month because her lease was tied to her income verification. 3 months of couch surfing with people she barely knew turned into 2 months of sleeping in her car in parking lots. Then the car broke down outside Richmond and she could not afford to fix it at all. She sold it for $300 to a man at a salvage yard who did not ask her any questions. She drifted south through the mountains on buses and rides from strangers after that. She ate gas station food and slept in church doorways and kept her few remaining possessions in a canvas duffel bag that grew lighter every single week. She arrived in Whitesburg on a Tuesday in early April because the bus stopped there and she had absolutely nowhere else to be. She stepped off the bus into the cool mountain air and stood on the cracked sidewalk for a long time looking at the storefronts and the mountains pressing close on every side. Nobody was waiting for her and nobody in the entire town knew she had arrived. The county clerk's office was in the basement of the Letcher County Courthouse at the far end of Main Street. A woman named Fern Lockhart sat behind the counter with a paper cup of coffee and a stack of property transfer forms arranged neatly beside her elbow. She had silver hair cut short and practical, and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up when Mirren walked in and studied her carefully for a long moment without saying anything at all. "Restroom is down the hall, on the left," Fern said at last. Mirren thanked her and used it gratefully. When she came back through the office, she noticed a hand-lettered card pinned to the bulletin board near the front door. It read, "Abandoned property, Watchmaker shop, Hillside above Maine. $1. As is. See clerk." Mirren pointed at the card. "Is that real?" Fern glanced over at the board and then back at Mirren. "Been up there 4 years now. County seized it for back taxes in 2019. Nobody wants a building you need to climb 27 steps to reach." "Who was the watchmaker?" Mirren asked. Fern took a slow sip of her coffee before answering. "Family name was Grayling. Collis Grayling opened the shop in 1883. His son ran it after him. The grandson was the last one to work there. Closed up around 1996 when his eyes went bad. Passed away in 2004 with no heirs at all." Mirren pulled a crumpled dollar bill from her jacket pocket and smoothed it flat on the counter. "I would like to buy it." Fern set down her coffee cup slowly. "You understand there's no plumbing, no power, and the roof leaks in at least 3 places?" "I understand," Mirren said quietly. Fern studied her for a long, quiet moment, then pulled a deed transfer form from the stack. She began filling it out in careful blue ink. "What is your full legal name?" Mirren told her. The paperwork took 20 minutes to complete and sign. Fern notarized it herself and charged nothing extra for the service. She handed Mirren a carbon copy of the deed and a single brass key on a plain metal ring. She told Mirren that the key opened the side door on the downhill face because the front lock had been broken for years. Mirren thanked her and turned to leave. Fern called after her from behind the counter, "There is a diner called the Cozy Corner on Main Street. Tell Bettina Yount I sent you. She will feed you." Mirren climbed the 27 stone steps to the shop that evening, with her duffel bag over her shoulder and the brass key warm in her fist. She unlocked the side door and stepped into the narrow building that now legally belonged to her. The last light of the day came through the tall, dusty windows and cast long amber stripes across the scarred workbench and the dusty floor. She set her bag down and sat on the bench stool and breathed in the old, familiar smell of machine oil and aged wood. She had a roof over her head for the first time in 5 months. It leaked in 3 places, but it belonged to her. Nobody could tell her to move along from her own building. That thought settled over her like a warm blanket in the growing dark. If you are enjoying this story so far, tap that subscribe button and the bell so you do not miss the next one. It really does help these stories reach new listeners. The dog appeared on the 3rd morning after she moved in. Mirren was sitting on the stone steps eating a sleeve of saltine crackers for breakfast when she heard a sharp, high bark from the terraced slope beside the building. She turned and saw a small dog standing on a flat rock about 10 feet away, watching her with enormous dark eyes that did not blink. It was a miniature pinscher mix, maybe 11 pounds at most, with a sleek black and tan coat stretched tight over a wiry, muscular frame. Tall pointed ears stood straight up like 2 radar dishes aimed directly at her face. The dog had an alert, bright expression and a thin whip-like tail that trembled slightly at the very tip. No collar anywhere on him, and his ribs were clearly visible through the short coat. Mirren held out half a cracker toward him. The dog tilted his head to the side and considered the offer for a long moment. Then he hopped down from the rock with surprising grace and trotted over to her on thin, precise legs. He took the cracker from her fingers with a delicate mouth and chewed it carefully and thoroughly. Then he sat down beside her on the stone step and leaned his small, warm body firmly against her knee. "You look like you know exactly what you're doing," Mirren told the dog quietly. The dog looked up at her, and his thin tail whipped back and forth twice against the stone. She named him Pivot, because he moved with quick, exact turns like the pivot wheel inside a watch movement, every single motion precise and deliberate and purposeful. Pivot followed her inside the shop without any hesitation at all. He walked the length of the narrow room and sniffed every cabinet drawer he could reach. He investigated under the workbench and then jumped onto the display counter. He sat there looking at her with calm approval. The renovation started with what Mirren could manage entirely for free. She swept out years of accumulated dust and mouse droppings and dried leaves that had blown through the broken front window. She pulled the remaining broken glass from the window frame carefully and covered the opening with heavy plastic she found in the courthouse dumpster down the hill. She hauled water from a spigot behind the courthouse in a plastic jug. She scrubbed the workbench surface with a stiff brush until the quarter-sawn oak grain emerged from under the grime, tight and straight and glowing. Fern stopped by on the second day with a thermos of coffee and a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She stood in the doorway and surveyed the narrow shop and Mirren's cleaning progress without saying anything for a while. "You actually moved in here," Fern said finally. "I did," Mirren said, "and I plan to stay right here." Fern nodded slowly and said she supposed Mirren would need to meet some people around town. Fern introduced her to Waylon Prewitt that same week. He was 68 years old, a retired coal mine electrician who lived in a small frame house at the very bottom of the hill below the shop. He had thick, weathered hands and a quiet, careful way of speaking that reminded Mirren of old Mr. Griggs back in Lexington. "Fern tells me you bought the old clock shop up on the hillside," Waylon said. He stood at the bottom of the stone steps and looked up at the building. "For $1, Mirren said from the top step. Waylon climbed the 27 steps without hurrying and walked through the shop slowly. He examined the walls and ceiling and floor with professional attention. He tapped the plaster in several places. He checked every window frame for rot. He opened the electrical panel box beside the side door and studied the wiring inside. "Whoever built this place knew what they were doing," he said, running his hand along a wall stud. He told Mirren the stone foundation was solid, but the wiring had to be completely replaced before she could turn anything on safely. Mirren asked what that would cost. Waylon folded his arms across his chest. "I have got wire and breakers in my basement from old jobs. I will rewire this place for whatever materials I do not already have. Call it $85. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Mirren asked him. "Because Fern asked me to," he said simply. He added that Fern had never once asked him for a favor in 40 years of knowing each other. Waylon rewired the shop over the course of the 4 long days of steady work. Mirren worked right alongside him the entire time, holding junction boxes steady while he connected circuits and pulling wire through the walls where his large hands could not fit. He showed her how to strip wire cleanly and how to test a circuit with a multimeter. She picked up every lesson quickly because her hands were already used to delicate and precise work from the watch repair bench. A woman named Vonda Shepard ran the hardware store on Main Street. When she heard what Mirren was doing up on the hillside, she brought a box of roofing shingles to the bottom of the stone steps. Vonda said they had been sitting in her stockroom for 3 years, doing nobody any good at all. Mirren patched the 3 leaking spots on the roof by herself, climbing up on a borrowed ladder and nailing each shingle carefully into place. Pivot watched from the stone steps below, with his pointed ears tracking her every movement across the roof line. The plumber was a young man named Gentry Mayhew, 29 years old. He charged Mirren only $120 for labor to connect the shop to the water main that ran up the hillside. The pipe was already there from the original installation in the 1950s, and it just needed new fittings and a pressure valve. Mirren bought the fittings for $45 at Vonda's hardware store down the hill. Total renovation cost after 8 weeks of steady work came to $782 all told. Electrical materials ran $85 and plumbing labor was $120. Pipe fittings cost $45 and caulk and wood glue added $28. Cleaning supplies were $12, and 2 panes of replacement window glass cost $67. Paint was $38 and hinges and hardware added $22. The wood stove cost $365, bought used from a man in Jenkins who was upgrading to propane heat. She cleaned the display cases until the glass gleamed like water. She oiled every single drawer, pulled in the massive cabinet wall, until each drawer slid open and shut with smooth precision. She sanded and refinished the old workbench until it glowed warm under the new overhead light that Waylon had wired for her. She polished the brass fittings on the front door and washed every window inside and out until real light poured through them for the first time in decades. The watchmaker's shop began to breathe again after all those years of sitting empty. You could feel it happening in the way the afternoon light moved through the tall, narrow windows. It fell across the workbench in golden bars that shifted slowly as the sun tracked westward across the valley. It was Pivot who found the clock case on a cool evening in her 9th week at the shop. If this story is keeping you company tonight, please leave a comment down below and let me know you are listening. Every single comment helps more than you know. Mirren was cleaning out the upstairs room that Wednesday evening, a small space maybe 10 by 12 feet that had served as a storage room and possibly sleeping quarters for the last watchmaker. Old wooden crates and cardboard boxes filled with watch parts and yellowed repair manuals lined every wall. In the far corner stood a tall grandfather clock case, nearly 7 feet high and made of dark walnut with a broken glass door panel on the face. Mirren had noticed the clock case before, but had never examined it closely. The clock mechanism had been removed long ago, and the case was just an empty wooden cabinet standing in the corner, gathering dust. She had planned to clean it up eventually and maybe sell it for a few dollars to someone who collected old casework. But Pivot would not leave it alone that evening. He stood in front of the clock case and whined with increasing urgency. Then he scratched at the base panel with his small, precise paws. Then he barked once, sharp and high and insistent, and looked back at Mirren with absolute certainty shining in his dark eyes. She knelt down beside the case and knocked on the base panel with her knuckles. It sounded hollow inside. She looked more closely and noticed something unusual about the construction. The panel was not nailed in place like the rest of the case at all. It was fitted with tiny brass hinges on the inside, completely invisible unless you already knew exactly where to look. A hidden compartment built into the bottom of a grandfather clock case by someone with a watchmaker's precision. Exactly the kind of secret space that a master craftsman would know how to build. "What did you find, Pivot?" she asked him softly. She pressed the lower right corner of the panel and it swung inward on its hidden hinges with a soft click. Inside the compartment was a dark space roughly 18 inches deep and 14 inches wide. Mirren reached in carefully and felt something wrapped in soft cloth. She pulled it out and set it gently on the floor beside her. The first object she unwrapped was a mechanical singing bird in a gilded cage standing about 9 inches tall. The cage was real gold leaf over brass, delicately worked with tiny wire bars no thicker than sewing needles. Inside the cage, a small mechanical bird covered in actual iridescent feathers sat perfectly still on a brass perch. Mirren found the winding key built into the base and turned it gently with her fingertips. The bird opened its tiny beak and sang, not a simple music box melody, but an actual trilling bird song produced by a miniature bellows mechanism inside the body. The tail moved up and down, and the head turned side to side, while the song played through the quiet room. The craftsmanship was absolutely staggering. She reached into the compartment again and pulled out a writing automaton figure about 8 inches tall. It was a small brass and porcelain figure of a man seated at a tiny desk, holding a real miniature pen in his right hand. The mechanism underneath drove a complex system of cams that moved the arm in a genuine writing motion across the desk. She could see dried ink residue still clinging to the nib of the pen. This figure had actually written words with real ink. The third piece was a dancing couple standing on an oval music box base with hand-painted porcelain faces and delicate glass eyes and 18th-century court clothing rendered in perfect miniature detail. When wound, the base played a slow minuet while the two figures rotated and dipped in a tiny ballroom dance with fluid and eerily lifelike movements. A mechanical pecking rooster stood 6 inches tall on a carved wooden base. Wound up, it lowered its painted head and pecked steadily at painted seeds on the platform while its tail feathers fanned open and closed with each measured peck. The paint was entirely hand-applied, and still vivid after all these years in the dark. The last automaton was a magician figure in a tiny top hat and silk cape standing behind a miniature table with 3 small brass cups. When activated, his right hand swept smoothly over an empty cup and lifted it to reveal a small brass coin underneath. The coin then vanished and reappeared under a different cup entirely through a mechanism of sliding panels completely invisible to the naked eye. 5 clockwork automaton figures in total, and each one was a masterpiece of mechanical artistry and precision. But there was still more inside the hidden compartment. Mirren reached deeper and pulled out a leather roll tied shut with a waxed cord. She unrolled it carefully on the workbench and found 3 jeweler's loops of different magnifications inside, each with hand-ground lenses set in beautifully turned brass housings. The glass in each loop was flawless and perfectly clear. These were not factory-made instruments at all. Someone had ground these lenses entirely by hand with extraordinary skill and patience, and at the very back of the compartment, her fingers found a soft chamois pouch that was surprisingly heavy for its small size. She loosened the drawstring and tilted the contents slowly into her open palm. 12 loose gemstones tumbled out, each one individually wrapped in its own piece of tissue paper. She unwrapped them one by one on the workbench under the bright overhead light. Deep red garnets caught the light and threw tiny sparks of crimson across the oak surface. Blue sapphires came in 3 different shades ranging from pale sky to deep navy. Golden topazes glowed like drops of warm honey held up to the afternoon sun. 12 hand-cut gemstones, not machine-cut, with the precise, irregular faceting that marked skilled handwork from the 19th century. Mirren Thatch sat on the workbench stool in the narrow watchmaker's shop and looked at the entire collection spread out before her on the scarred oak surface. The 5 automaton figures stood in a neat row. The loops lay in their unrolled leather case. The gemstones sparkled against the dark wood grain. She did not move or speak for a very long time. Pivot jumped onto the workbench and walked carefully between the automaton figures, sniffing each one with his pointed ears pricked sharply forward. He sat down beside the gilded birdcage and looked at Mirren with steady eyes. "I do not even know what to say right now," she whispered to him softly. He tilted his head to the side, and his thin tail tapped once against the bench surface. Fern knew a woman who could help with something like this. She always seemed to know exactly the right person to call in any situation. Doctor. Linnea Kellum was a horological historian and certified antique appraiser who worked out of a studio apartment in Hazard, about 45 minutes west of Whitesburg. She had spent 30 years documenting and appraising rare timepieces and mechanical objects across the entire Appalachian region. Dr. Kellum arrived at the shop on a Saturday morning, carrying a leather case of her own professional tools. She was 71 years old, sharp-eyed and deliberate in every movement she made. She climbed the 27 stone steps without complaint and walked into the shop and stopped cold in the doorway when she saw the 5 automaton figures arranged on the workbench in the afternoon light. She did not speak for nearly a full minute, just stood there looking at them. Then she set her leather case on the bench and opened it and began examining each figure with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. She spent over 2 hours with the collection that afternoon. She examined the mechanisms inside each automaton with her own professional loupe and tested each winding mechanism by hand. She photographed every surface and every marking she could find. She held each gemstone up to a portable light source and studied the cut angles and internal clarity carefully. "Where exactly did you find these?" she asked Mirren quietly. Mirren told her about the hidden compartment built into the base of the grandfather clock case upstairs. Dr. Kellum nodded slowly and looked back at the figures on the bench. "The automatons are European, most likely Swiss or French in origin, dating from approximately 1830 to 1870. The singing bird follows the Jacques Dros's workshop tradition closely. The writing automaton is exceptionally rare, and fewer than 50 surviving examples of this particular type exist anywhere in the entire world. Mirren asked about the gemstones next. Doctor. Kellum picked up a deep blue sapphire and held it up to the light and turned it slowly between her fingertips. Hand-cut, and the faceting style is consistent with American lapidary work from the mid to late 1800s. These garnets are Appalachian almandine garnets from local deposits. The sapphires likely come from western Carolina. The topazes may be Brazilian import stones that were recut domestically by a skilled American lapidary. She set the sapphire down and looked at Mirren directly across the workbench. The 5 automaton figures together are worth between $32,000 and $45,000 at auction. The writing automaton alone could bring $15,000 to the right collector. The 3 hand-ground loops are worth approximately $2,000 to $3,000 as a matched set, and the 12 gemstones, given their quality and likely provenance, between $10,000 and $14,000. Mirren asked for the total value of the entire collection. Doctor. Kellum paused and calculated silently for a moment. Conservatively, the entire collection is worth between $44,000 and $62,000. The shop got very quiet after those numbers settled into the air. Mirren could hear the wind pushing against the tall windows and Pivot breathing softly on the bench beside her. She looked down at her own hands resting on the scarred wood surface, calloused and rough from weeks of scrubbing and hammering and hauling water up 27 stone steps. She was 22 years old and homeless since October, owner of a $1 watchmaker's shop on a Kentucky hillside. "What do you want to do with them?" Dr. Kellum asked gently. Mirren did not answer right away. She reached over and wound the singing bird automaton one more time. The gilded cage glinted under the workbench light, and the tiny feathered bird opened its beak and sang its mechanical song into the narrow room, each note thin and sweet and impossibly precise. She decided to keep the automaton figures, all 5 of them. She arranged them carefully in the glass display cases along the left wall of the shop, each one wound and ready for any visitor to activate and enjoy. She kept the 3 loops on the workbench where they belonged. She sold 8 of the 12 gemstones through Dr. Kellum's auction contacts, and 4 garnets and 2 sapphires and 2 topazes brought a total of $7,800 after the auction commission was subtracted. She kept 4 stones for herself, 1 deep garnet, 1 navy sapphire, 1 pale sapphire, and 1 golden topaz. With the money from the gemstone sale, Mirren did 3 important things. She paid Vonda at the hardware store every penny she owed for materials purchased on credit. She deposited $4,000 in a savings account at the credit union branch in Whitesburg. It was the first bank account she had ever opened. She stared at the printed balance for a long time. "I have a bank account," she whispered to Pivot in the lobby. He wagged his thin tail. And she bought a proper set of watch repair tools from an estate sale in Pikeville. Tweezers and screwdrivers and pin vises and a mainspring winder, all professional grade, for $340 total. She set up the workbench as a functioning watch repair station and put a small, hand-lettered sign in the newly cleaned front window. The sign read, "Watch Repair. Bring your timepieces." She charged $15 for a basic cleaning and $25 for a full movement service, and the work came slowly at first. A farmer from up the hollow brought his grandfather's pocket watch. It had not run in 20 years, and he asked if she could fix it. Mirren told him she would try her best. A woman from town came with a wristwatch that had a cracked crystal. A retired miner brought in a mantel clock that had been chiming at all the wrong hours. Word spread the way it always does in these small mountain towns, quietly and steadily from neighbor to neighbor at the post office and the diner and after church services on Sunday mornings. Whalen brought his late wife's anniversary watch to Mirren on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a delicate gold piece from the 1960s with a broken balance staff that had silenced it years ago. Mirren replaced the staff with a part she machined carefully from a blank, using the old watchmaker's lathe she had found in the upstairs storage room. When she handed the running watch back to Whalen, he held it against his ear and listened to it tick. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. His eyes were shining, but he smiled. Gentry Mayhew brought in 3 watches that belonged to various members of his family. Vonda sent her hardware store customers up the stone steps regularly. Bettina at the Cozy Corner Diner started telling every tourist who walked through her door about the young watchmaker up on the hill above Main Street. Fern mentioned the shop to every single person who came into the clerk's office for any reason at all. The old Grayling watchmaker's shop was alive again after all those decades of standing empty. The workbench held tools and movements and tiny brass parts that caught the afternoon light. The display cases held 5 extraordinary mechanical figures that sang and wrote and danced and pecked and performed magic for anyone who wanted to see them. The tall, narrow windows let in long bars of golden afternoon light that moved slowly across the floor. And a small black and tan dog sat on the counter with his pointed ears standing straight up, watching every person who climbed the 27 stone steps with bright, interested eyes. On a clear evening in late September, Mirren Thatch sat on the top stone step with Pivot curled in her lap and the valley stretching out below her in every direction. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the valley below was slowly filling up with blue shadow. She could see the rooftops of Whitesburg turning gold in the very last of the light. Smoke rose from a chimney somewhere down the hill, and the mountains stood quiet and dark against the fading sky. She was 22 years old, and she had lost everything and drifted through the mountains with nothing but a duffel bag and the memory of how to hold a watch spring without breaking it. She had walked into a courthouse basement because she needed a restroom and walked out owning a building for a single $1. She had found a dog on a rocky hillside in a hidden compartment inside a clock case. She had found a collection of mechanical wonders that a watchmaker tucked away and never told a living soul about. She had found a town full of quiet, generous people who said her name like she had always lived among them. Pivot pressed his warm head against her forearm, and his thin tail tapped steadily against her knee in the gathering dusk. Somewhere inside the shop behind them, the singing bird automaton wound down its last few notes, and the mechanical trill faded slowly into the quiet mountain air above the valley. Mirren whispered to Pivot that they were home now. He closed his dark eyes and sighed deeply, and the evening settled around them both like something that had been waiting there patiently for a very long time. If this story meant something to you tonight, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs a little comfort right now. These stories reach new ears, only because kind people like you take the time to pass them along. Thank you so much for being here.